Lecture 31 is called Atlantic Slavery. A theme that you might keep in mind here are the consequences of the Columbian Exchange that we talked about last week. Think about these big consequences. Atlantic slavery is one. European imperialism is another, and we'll talk about imperialism in our next lecture. We have a revolution in human diet as a result of the Columbian Exchange because so many domesticated plants and animals and grains and different foods are now going to become available worldwide. Of course, we have the destruction of the people of the Western Hemisphere. The indigenous people of the Americas had no immunity to these European diseases, and they died in great numbers following Columbus. Another consequence of the Columbian Exchange, triangular trade. Think of the triangle: West African labor in the form of slaves, New World commodities in the form of cotton, sugar, tobacco, indigo, rice, and then European manufactured goods. This creates a circuit of trade in the Atlantic basin, linking the New World to Africa to Europe. Eurocentric, this topic? Well, not really, not when you consider the impact of American products on the world market. We mentioned silver the last time. Silver floods into India and China as Europeans finally have a way to pay for these luxury goods, the spices, porcelain, and silk, and so on and so forth. Think about the impact of sugar, New World sugar on the world market. Think about potatoes. Potatoes are indigenous to the Andes, high in calories, easily stored. Corn, a major player in this diet revolution. Of course, tobacco, beginning as a luxury product and then slowly but surely becoming available to everyone. Chocolate, vanilla, peppers. Remember that a lot of these commodities are produced by African slaves. Eurocentric, well, over 11 million Africans are brought to the New World as slaves. Slaves plus the commodities that they produce create this circuit of trade that I've just discussed a moment ago that links the entire Atlantic world together and beyond. A little background here. For centuries, the winds and the currents off the West African coast had kept foreigners from approaching African societies. Atlantic trade was not essential for Africans who were largely self-sufficient. Africa's trade with Europe was largely moved by prestige, luxury goods, changing taste, a desire for variety, and also firearms, which enhanced the power of African chieftains, allowing them to gather more slaves, which could then be sold to the Europeans. Africa resembled feudal Europe in its political fragmentation, no overarching authority, in other words. I want to mention African agency here for a moment. Slaves obviously leave very little documentation that reflects their point of view. This tends to leave them silent, passive, helpless in historical accounts. And this is wrong-headed, it's simply incorrect. Europeans did not possess the military power to force Africans to participate in the slave trade or any other sort of trade. African chiefs controlled the slave trade. And we have a lot of evidence that deals with this aspect of slavery. Europeans are at the mercy of African rulers. European captains of ships would sometimes be stuck in a harbor for months at a time, waiting for African chieftains to make the decision to finally trade slaves for European manufactured goods. These facts tend to complicate a story that's previously been rendered as simply European brutality and African victimhood. It's not that simple. Again, Africans exercise a great deal of agency, the will and the capacity to act. A couple of useful categories to keep in mind while we talk about slavery. We have slave societies. And then we have what historians call societies with slaves. Slave societies are those where slavery is fundamental. It is the laboring force. A slave society would collapse without slaves. Think of the Old South here in the United States before the war, before the Civil War. That was a slave society where slavery is essential. Now, societies with slaves is different. Here, slavery is not essential. Slaves are merely one component of the labor market. You could take slaves out of a society with slaves and nobody would miss them except perhaps their owners. An example, well, West African societies are generally societies with slaves. The American North before the Civil War, a society with slaves. They're not essential. Where do the slaves go? What are their destinations? Well, most of them go to Brazil. A large portion go to the West Indies, the Greater and Lesser Antilles, Central America, the Caribbean. A much smaller percentage go to the North American coast, to Savannah, Charleston, Norfolk, Baltimore. You can look at the map here of slave destinations, and you can see the great percentage that go to the West Indies and Brazil, and ask yourself the question, why? Well, these slaves here in Brazil and the West Indies are producing sugar. This is a labor-intensive crop. This is a tropical climate. It's a dangerous commodity to produce. You got men hacking away with machetes, and people are going to lose appendages hacking away in sugarcane fields. Sugarcane is tough, and it takes a lot of work to produce it. So slaves die in great numbers in Brazil and the West Indies, and have to constantly be, their numbers have to constantly be replenished by bringing in more slaves. Just a word here about African slavery. I alluded to this a moment ago. Slavery was traditional and widespread in Africa, independent of any European involvement. African conceptions of private ownership differed from that of the Europeans. For Africans, slaves were the only form of private, revenue-producing property recognized by law. Ownership of land, on the other hand, was communal. Ownership of human beings was private. Slaves were a source of wealth for Africans. Think of polygamy. The man with the most wives has great status among his peers, just as a man with many slaves. Now, another basic question, why Africans? Why are Africans, the population, destined for slavery? Let's look at some of these factors. Number one, there's an unlimited number, or at least appears to be, an unlimited number of Africans available. The indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere were killed off either through disease or through violence and brutality. So you have to have another population to take their place as workers. The African slave trade already exists. Like I said before, slavery in Africa is traditional. It's been going on for centuries. So the Europeans are simply taking part in this commerce in humanity. They don't have to create anything. They simply have to go shopping, essentially, for human beings. There is an assumption on the part of the Europeans that Africans will thrive, or at least survive, in the tropical climates of the Western Hemisphere. After all, they live in a semi-tropical climate in Africa. So if you look at the map and see and follow the latitude lines from West Africa across the Atlantic, you'll see they're quite similar to the West Indies and Brazil. It's assumed that, for instance, if you were to take pasty-skinned Irishmen to these tropical climates, that they would wilt and die. So the assumption is that Africans will survive in this harsh climate. A lot of these West African slaves have a genetic mutation called the sickle cell, and this allows them to fight off malaria, which of course is the great killer. Africans possess the necessary skills. They're an agricultural people, and they know how to do what we need them to do in the Western Hemisphere. And then last, and perhaps most important, Africans are color-coded. White equals free, black equals slave. If you can let this sort of sink in, it makes perfect sense. If we were to use Irish as slaves, an Irishman could dress up and look like us, right, and walk down the street and appear to be a free person. Africans can't do that. Their skin color codes them as slaves. Just a brief word here about the Middle Passage. This is the sea route between West Africa and the New World. Here we see human beings, Africans, reduced to labor commodities. This is a good example of what we call the historical other. You often see this in quotation marks. The other are those people who are not like us. They may not have the same skin color, worship the same God, read the same literature, speak the same language. National origins may be different. So Africans are a good example of what we're capable of dealing with fellow human beings. This Middle Passage, of course, can last a month or 6 weeks, depending on the currents and the wind. And you have Africans shackled below the decks of these ships. Of course, there's seasickness, human waste, disease. Some of these slave women are pregnant and are giving birth aboard ship. You have suicides because of the brutality. There's an excellent film by Steven Spielberg. It's called Amistad. It's a story of a slave ship. And there, in the center of this film is a depiction of the Middle Passage, and it's worth watching. Think about the slave ship during the Middle Passage. Think about how the white crew attempt to maintain control, crowd control. The slaves are shackled to the decks, obviously. There's arbitrary violence to intimidate the slaves. There's rape, which can be witnessed by all. Again, it tends to intimidate both the men and the women who are helpless to stop it. We can distribute rations in such a way to keep the slaves fighting among themselves for food, as opposed to conspiring with each other to take over our ship. And we can mix these slaves by language so that it's more difficult for them to communicate. Again, this lessens the possibility of a conspiracy to kill the crew and take over the ship. So some conclusions here on this discussion of Atlantic slavery. Slavery allows us a glimpse, again, of what we are capable of as a species. When we designate a group of people as the other, then we can do with them as we wish. Remember that slaves produce the commodities that make the Atlantic trade circuit work. Slaves produce the commodities that impact the Asian trade as well. And remember that the initial wealth of the Western world is built on the backs of African slaves. Thank you.